Here's how Ukraine can win in 2025. Ukraine's unwillingness to give the invaders even an inch of land. The atrocities that have already been perpetrated against the Ukrainian people, and Russia's hollowed out military and cancerous political leadership all tell me that Ukraine will win this war. Allow me to make my case. Settle in, because this is a bit longer than my normal videos. Privyet, Druzy, my name is Wes O'Donnell, veteran of the U.S. Army and the U.S. Air Force, and today I'm going to break down why I think Ukraine will win this war. By the way, if you're new here, thanks for stopping by. I'm a writer and an intel forecaster, and I'm in my last year of law school because, well, I needed to spend my GI Bill on something. Might as well be national security law. When you subscribe, you help me add my voice to the chorus of Ukraine supporters. Okay, that's my pitch. Let's jump in. When Russia invaded in force in the winter of 2022, back when Russia was perceived to have a modern, lethal military, I already started thinking about how Ukraine could fight a guerrilla war once Russia fully conquered. Of course, that's not what happened. Many analysts in the West, myself included, were surprised at both the Russian military's lack of combat effectiveness and Ukraine's tech genius. But the biggest lesson learned was Ukrainian defiance and an unwillingness to be conquered. Even if Russia did take Kiev and occupy the country, I now do not doubt that Ukraine would have fought an effective insurgency that would make the Soviet experience in Afghanistan pale by comparison. Just last week, a reader on Substack asked me if I think Ukraine can win. My answer is yes. Here's why. First, let's talk about Russian military incompetence and the waste of lives on the front lines. In 1853, Tolstoy made some comments on the state of the Tsarist Russian army during the Crimean War that sound eerily like today. Quote, "We have no army. We have a horde of slaves, cowed by discipline, ordered about by thieves and slave traders. This horde is not an army because it possesses neither any real loyalty to faith, the Tsar, or the motherland. All it possesses are, on one hand, passive patience and repressed discontent, and on the other, cruelty, servitude, and corruption." End quote. Today, not much has changed. Russian commanders are wasting their soldiers' lives in reckless, performative assaults aimed at currying favor with higher-ups, according to a frustrated Russian military blogger brought to my attention by Wiki on X. The Russian mill blogger in question recently made a lengthy post lamenting the death of his friends at the hands of corrupt Russian military officers. His scathing critique sheds light on one of the driving factors behind Russia's staggering casualty rates. This isn't the first time Russian commentators have pointed out the Army's deeply rooted culture of deceit, ranging from sham training exercises to inflated troop numbers, and premature boasts of capturing objectives. These lies often force troops into brutal and often futile efforts to turn fiction into reality, leading to devastating losses on the battlefield. And thanks to Wiki on X for this information. I've translated the Telegram post myself from this mill blogger, but my Russian is, it's a little bit rusty, so please forgive any odd-sounding sentences if you go to my Substack and read the full translation. I'm aware that I could have used Google Translate, but I wanted some authenticity. Russian units killing soldiers who refuse to follow suicidal orders is well documented. White House National Security spokesman John Kirby said last year, quote, "From the very beginning, we've been talking about poor command and control, poor logistics, and poor sustainment. They can't feed their guys in the field for crying out loud, and now, again, they're willing to shoot them for not following orders." End quote. There are some cultural reasons for this abuse that I'll get to later in this video, but one of the biggest reasons I've identified for the poor battlefield performance and astronomical casualty rate is a complete lack of non-commissioned officers. Non-commissioned officers, NCOs, are the secret sauce that makes America's military lethal on the battlefield. With many modern militaries, service members are divided into officers, those with at least a 4-year degree, and enlisted, those with a high school diploma, although many enlisted also have degrees, I should note. The Russian military is also broken down into officers and enlisted. However, the US has something that the Russian military doesn't. NCOs, who act as middle managers to whom the officers can delegate leadership. In the US, NCOs, enlisted service members at or above the rank of Army Sergeant and Marine Corporal, Air Force Staff Sergeant, and Navy Petty Officer, are trusted experts who execute officers' battlefield orders and take care of the troops. It works like this. An infantry officer orders a U.S. Army unit to take an enemy airfield. The details of how to take the airfield, as well as how to deal with unexpected roadblocks, fall to the enlisted NCOs. This frees up the officers to think about strategy, while the NCOs think about execution. NCOs have tremendous decision-making power on the battlefield. Mission command, at least in the U.S., is pushed to the lowest rank possible. Because of this life-or-death responsibility, every U.S. branch sends its lower enlisted to a leadership school before the service member can get promoted to the NCO Corps. Senior NCOs go to advanced leadership schools as they progress in their careers. In the U.S. military, officers and NCOs are inexorably linked together. Each commander has an NCO counterpart, from the service chiefs all the way down to the platoon level. Staying with the U.S. Army example, every platoon has a platoon leader as an officer and a platoon sergeant enlisted. Each company has a company commander, officer, and a first sergeant enlisted, and so on, all the way to the top. This pairing facilitates better communication and better task orientation and ensures that the troops' needs are being met. In fact, NCO's most important job is ensuring that the troops are taken care of, healthy, fed, clothed, equipped, rested, and prepared to keep them combat ready. You can see the complete failure of unit cohesion in Ukraine in the Russian ground force. Troops that aren't taken care of are miserable. Actually, the infantry are always miserable, but I mean more miserable than normal. And if the troops are miserable, mutual trust falls apart and shared understanding is non-existent. Objectives just don't get completed. So, how is the Russian military organized? Well, the Russian military is primarily made up of two types of troops: conscript soldiers and contract soldiers. Because conscript soldiers have such short tours of duty, currently only 1 year, they are reserved for more menial military jobs like drivers, cooks, and low-level maintenance. On the other hand, Russia's contract soldiers are the trigger pullers who fill positions that require more advanced skills. Interestingly, these two types of soldiers don't typically interact with one another. Needless to say, Russian conscripts are treated very poorly, especially in training where hazing is a well-known problem. But it's worth mentioning that there is no centralized Russian training system like basic training in the US for conscript soldiers. They simply report to induction stations and then are transferred to their units for on-the-job training. As of December 2018, Russia only has 384,000 professional contract soldiers. Further confusing things is that Russia offers some conscripts the option of serving on a 2-year contract instead of completing a 1-year conscription period. Now, the number of these two-and-done contract soldiers is not available for analysis, so a significant portion of these 384,000 contract soldiers may serve on very short contracts. This makes sense, as many young men might favor being a 2-year contract soldier over being a 1-year conscript so they can receive better treatment. All of this is to illustrate that even if Russia wanted to develop a professional NCO corps, it wouldn't be feasible under the current conscript contract system. It takes years of experience and leadership training to advance to the rank of sergeant, or petty officer in Western militaries. In Russia, they just don't have the structure for it under their hybrid system. Russia did try to implement an NCO corps in the past, and many soldiers either left when their contract was up or applied to the officer corps. So how does Russia fight wars without NCOs? Well, you can see the impact of Russia's leadership structure in how well they integrate aerial fire with their ground maneuver. Without this lower level leadership, Russia simply can't coordinate and communicate as effectively as they could. Currently, the Russian military is top heavy with officers who handle all those issues that NCOs might handle. This helps explain why Russia has lost so many officers in Ukraine, a rare occurrence in modern wars. Having so many young enlisted fighters accountable only to the officer in charge is a complete alien concept to me. Without NCOs, how do you maintain discipline? How do you evacuate the wounded effectively? How do you constantly ensure that your troops have the correct ammo in sufficient amounts for the mission? I have so many questions. Arguably, Russia does not want well-rounded enlisted leaders. They want narrowly focused, technically competent enlisted soldiers who get their orders from the better informed officer corps. But in Ukraine, we're seeing the results of that doctrine, and it's not going well for Russia. Also, it's worth noting that many other countries fight without NCOs, and a cursory look at their battlefield records confirms why I think they're essential. Let's see. Egyptian regular forces have no NCO corps and faced difficulties against Yemeni irregulars in the 1960s. Iraq had no NCOs during their wars against Iran and the US, and they fared poorly, although granted, the US had far superior technological advantages. Similarly, Syrians have no NCOs and managed to assert control in Lebanon during the mid-1970s, but only through the use of overwhelming weaponry and numbers. The next reason I think Ukraine's going to win is Russia's severe logistical problems. The Russian army is a rail army. It has long been built around its rail network, a product of its vast Eurasian geography and centuries of military planning. Its structure includes 10 specialized rail troop brigades, emphasizing just how critical logistics are to Russian operations. These specialized troops are called Material Technical Support, or MTO brigades. Each MTO brigade is committed to supporting one combined arms army, with 2 in the Western Military District, 2 in the Southern Military District, 2 in the Central Military District, and 4 in the Eastern Military District. With access to a staggering 66,000 flatbed rail cars, these units can transport the entirety of Russia's ground forces all at once, a capability that existed even before the significant losses that Russia endured in Ukraine. But the true logistical capabilities of an MTO brigade remain somewhat of a mystery, and for good reason. The Ukraine war, is the first conflict where Russia's MTO structure is being tested under real-world conditions, and it's almost certain that the Russians are encountering challenges they didn't anticipate. As these issues emerge, the Russian military will be scrambling to adapt and find solutions, but as of now, it's not looking good. Russian logistics in Ukraine seem to be largely unmechanized, which is a major red flag. Russia's lack of pallet use, widely considered essential for the efficient movement of military goods, reveals a huge inefficiency. To put it into perspective, pallets are what determine the difference between a 4-hour palletized and mechanized unloading task and a 3-day non-palletized and non-mechanized, but otherwise identical unloading task. This self-inflicted logistical bottleneck is likely undermining Russia's operations, especially at key transfer points. As a result, Russia's logistical system appears capable of supporting only 3 battalion tactical groups per axis of advance at any given time. This is a big point that I'm making here. Russia's logistical issues are directly and adversely affecting its frontline combat power. How many MTO brigades are propping up the invasion force remains unclear, but this inefficiency is clearly hampering their overall combat capability. The next reason I think Ukraine's going to win: dispelling the myth of the invincible Russian. Whether it's the result of pop culture influence or examples of Russian soldiers from World War II all the way to Ukraine, there is a persistent myth in the West that Russians never quit. Many Western analysts simply could not imagine a modern 21st century soldier recklessly throwing their life away the way Russian soldiers are doing right now on Ukraine's front lines. But there's also a cultural angle here. Russia is a culture defined by a shared trauma, a shared nationalism, and fatalism. As Ben Conable wrote on the military blog War on the Rocks, Russian soldiers fatalistically submit to horrific treatment by their own leaders and fellow soldiers, hopeless combat missions designed to kill them, and unending deployments that require either victory or death. But this doesn't mean that they're invincible. In fact, history shows that they can be broken. As Ben Conable writes, first on the battlefield scale, there are numerous examples of frontline Russian soldiers surrendering to Ukrainian troops. Entire units collapsed and fled in Kharkiv during Ukraine's Thunder Run offensive. Over 600 Russians surrendered in Kursk just in the first weeks of the 2024 incursion. What's more, if we look at history, well over 5 million Red Army soldiers surrendered to the Germans in World War II. Thousands more surrendered to irregular Chechen fighters in the mid-1990s. Russian soldiers can and do break. If we zoom out to the Russian home front, during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the public began to abandon any sense of victory in only its second year. Eventually, Soviet leaders began to see the war as a bleeding wound and withdrew in defeat. Something very similar happened in Chechnya in 1994. Russian civilians at home grew war-weary due to bad policies, bad treatment of soldiers, and bad economic conditions. Interestingly, those same factors are facing Russians today in the Ukraine war. Granted, there is a different political environment now in Moscow than in the 1990s, but it's impossible to know how many Russians truly support the Ukraine war because polling can't be trusted. And thank you to Ben Conable at War on the Rocks for this information. Finally, Putin himself has a breaking point. His bizarre impotence during Wagner's uprising last year gave us a critical window into his true capability to put down internal discontent. I believe his grip on power is not nearly as strong as it's commonly reported. At the very least, I believe Putin will settle for terms that are unfavorable if it means he maintains power in Moscow. Okay, so how can Ukraine win? Well, I've discussed this before, but I think it's a worthy exercise to revisit my idea of Russian long-term combat potential, much smaller frontline combat power, and the broken conveyor belt that connects the two. Those who oppose Ukraine often point to Russia's ongoing capacity to make war, their unlimited supply of manpower to draw from, vast natural resources, and military industries that have not been impacted by Western sanctions to the extent that we had hoped. There is a misconception about how well, or more accurately, how poorly, Russia can convert capacity into combat power. This gives us a reason to be optimistic about Ukraine's prospects in the long term. And I would even feel confident in saying that Ukraine could win a war of attrition against Russia. Now, I know what you're thinking. Win a war of attrition against Russia? Wes, you must be smoking that wacky tobacco. Hear me out. Let's imagine a large barrel representing Russia's long-term capacity for making war. All of Russia's natural resources, political leadership, military factories, manpower, etc. Everything gets dumped into this barrel. Their war-making capacity barrel has a conveyor belt attached to it. This conveyor belt represents Russia's near-term ability to convert capacity into frontline power. But this conveyor belt is barely functioning because of corruption, supply chain woes, low morale, officers with no experience, poor vehicle maintenance, and more. And on the other end of this broken conveyor belt is a much smaller barrel that represents Russia's actual frontline combat power. The way I see it, Ukraine has 3 paths to victory. First, Ukraine could attack the big barrel. How? Continue to fight and hold out long enough until Russia's long-term capacity is so reduced that it cannot sustain frontline combat power. More importantly, Ukraine could strike Russian ammo depots, airfields, and oil refineries with US-supplied long-range weapons in Russia. Second, Ukraine could attack the conveyor belt by capitalizing on Russia's crumbling military infrastructure and poor logistics. But never interrupt an enemy when he's making a mistake. Russia needs no help in destroying its own conveyor belt. Third, Ukraine could attack the small barrel and drain Russia's frontline combat power faster than it can be refilled. This means eliminating troops, tanks, helicopters, infantry fighting vehicles, and ammunition faster than Russia can replace them. Doing this leaves large gaps in Russia's combat ability and creates openings for future Ukrainian offensives. I believe the first option is the shortest path to victory, attacking the big barrel. But it would require allowing Ukraine to use Western cruise missiles inside Russia. Now, I have reason to believe that this decision has already been made, but not publicized. A good example of hitting the large barrel is Ukraine's recent strike against the ammo depot in Torpets that resulted in that massive explosion. Ukraine struck the big barrel, and now the frontline combat power will suffer. When people think about the Russian military, they tend to envision the big barrel, long-term capacity. But the Ukraine war has shown us that their actual frontline combat power is a small fraction of that capacity. Continuing to hit these Russian targets in Russia will hasten the rate at which Russia may break and settle to terms that are favorable to Ukraine. Finally, let's talk about Ukraine's will and tenacity to fight. Of course, no analysis would be complete without acknowledging, as I did at the beginning of the video, that the national character and the will of the Ukrainian people is such that they will never allow themselves to be conquered. Especially after the brutal war crimes and innocent civilians who have been killed, some in their own homes, during Russia's aggression. Add in Ukraine's MacGyver ability to combine Soviet-era weapon systems, Western systems, and civilian off-the-shelf solutions, and combine them in new and lethal combinations. And I believe Ukraine will ultimately win this war. That's it for now. Please subscribe if you're not already, and if you hit that like button, it really helps this video go further out into the ecosystem. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Wes O'Donnell. Glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes. Slava Ukraini.